the letter that knew too much. There's a moment in every investigation where you have to stop and ask yourself, what is this piece of evidence actually telling me? Not what it's supposed to tell me, not what someone wanted it to tell me, but what it's actually saying when I strip away the assumptions and just look at what's there. The ransom note in the JonBenet Ramsey case is one of those pieces of evidence. For years, we've been told to read it as proof of an intruder, as evidence of a kidnapping, as the desperate words of criminals demanding money for a child's safe return. But when you sit with it, really sit with it, it starts to tell a different story, a stranger story, a story about someone who knew too much, who wrote too long, who revealed more than they meant to. And that story doesn't point away from the house. It points right back inside. Theme 1. The ransom note that forgot to function. Let's start with something simple. What is a ransom note supposed to do? At its most basic level, a ransom note is a business transaction. It's a demand. I have something you want. Give me what I want and I'll give you back what you want. It should be efficient, clear, direct. Because kidnappers, real kidnappers, understand that every second they spend in contact with the family or the police is a second they could be caught. So they keep it short. They make their demand, they set a deadline, they give instructions, and then they disappear until it's time to collect. That's how ransom notes work. That's how they've always worked. Brief, transactional, focused on the exchange. So when we look at the ransom note found in the Ramsey house that morning, the first thing we should notice, the thing that should make us stop and tilt our heads, is that it doesn't work that way at all. It's long, almost 3 pages, handwritten on paper from inside the house using a pen from inside the house, written at a location inside the house. And the length alone should tell us something, because length serves no criminal purpose. Length doesn't make you more likely to get paid. Length doesn't make the family more compliant. Length just increases your exposure, increases the chance you'll be caught, increases the forensic evidence you're leaving behind. So why write a novel when a paragraph would do? Let's think about this logically. If you're a criminal who has just taken a child from her home in the middle of the night, your priority is getting out, getting distance, getting somewhere safe where you can wait for the money. You don't linger. You don't sit down at a desk and write for 20 minutes. Carefully composing sentences, referencing movies, demonstrating your vocabulary. You write the bare minimum necessary to communicate your demand, and then you leave. Every second you spend in that house is a second you could be discovered. The parents could wake up. The son could come downstairs. A neighbor could see your car. The risk compounds with every passing minute. But this note wasn't written in haste. It wasn't scrawled in shaky handwriting with misspellings and urgency. It was composed, deliberate, almost leisurely in its attention to detail. And that tells us something profound about the person who wrote it. They weren't worried about being caught. They weren't worried about someone walking in on them. They felt comfortable enough, safe enough, to take their time. Why would a stranger feel comfortable in someone else's home in the middle of the night? Why would an intruder, someone who had just broken in and taken a child, feel so secure that they could sit down and write 3 pages? They wouldn't. Unless they weren't a stranger at all, unless they were someone who belonged in that house, someone who knew the rhythms of the household, who knew where people slept, who knew they wouldn't be interrupted, someone who had the time and the space to craft a story. From a philosophical standpoint, let's think about what it means to write a message that no one will ever respond to. Because that's what this note is, isn't it? A message that was never meant to be answered. The note demands $118,000, an oddly specific figure that just happens to match John Ramsey's bonus that year almost exactly. It gives detailed instructions about how the money should be prepared. It threatens dire consequences if the instructions aren't followed. It promises a phone call between 8 and 10 a.m. to give further details about the exchange. But that call never came, and more importantly, no one who wrote that note ever expected it to come. Because if you're planning to actually collect ransom money, you keep the note simple and you keep yourself available to follow through. You don't write 3 pages of theatrical posturing and then disappear. You don't make demands you have no intention of fulfilling. You don't set a timeline you know won't be met. So if the note wasn't written to actually collect ransom, what was it written for? What function did it serve? The only logical answer is that it was written to create a narrative, to point the investigation in a specific direction, to buy time, to explain JonBenet's absence in a way that made sense while the person who wrote it figured out what to do next. It was misdirection, pure and simple. A story designed to keep everyone looking outward, at foreign factions and movie-inspired criminals, when the truth was right there in the house the whole time. Psychologically, there's something revealing about the need to write it all. Think about it. If you've just taken a child and you plan to ask for ransom, the note could be prepared ahead of time. You could type it on a computer, print it out, bring it with you. That would be safer, more efficient, less traceable. But this note was handwritten on materials found in the house, which means it was written after the person was already inside, after they already had access to JonBenet. So why not prepare it beforehand? Why take the risk of writing it in the moment? The answer is either that the person didn't plan ahead, which seems unlikely given the elaborate staging we see elsewhere in the crime scene, or they couldn't prepare it ahead of time because they didn't know they were going to need it, which means something happened that night that wasn't planned. Something went wrong. And the note became necessary after the fact, as a way to explain what couldn't be explained any other way. That's the psychology of reactive staging. It's not the work of someone executing a plan. It's the work of someone scrambling to create a story that covers up something they didn't mean to happen. And the note's length, its detail, its theatrical quality, all of that suggests someone who is trying very hard to convince, not just the police, not just the public, maybe themselves. From a physiological perspective, consider what it takes to write 3 pages by hand in the middle of a crisis. Your hands need to be steady. Your mind needs to be focused. You need to be able to think linearly, to construct sentences, to maintain a coherent voice throughout. That's not easy to do when you're panicked, when your body is flooded with adrenaline, when your heart is racing, when every sound makes you jump. Your handwriting suffers, you shake, you make mistakes, you cross things out, you rush through it. But this note doesn't show those signs. Yes, there are a few places where the writer seems to have stopped and started again, where the handwriting changes slightly. But overall, it's controlled, legible, careful, which tells us that whoever wrote it wasn't in a state of acute physiological panic. They weren't terrified of being caught. They weren't rushing to get out of the house. They were calm enough, centered enough to write neatly and thoughtfully for however long it took to fill 3 pages. And that calmness is strange, isn't it? Because if you're a stranger in someone's home, having just committed a felony, you should be anything but calm. Your body should be screaming at you to run. But this person stayed. This person sat down. This person took their time. Because on some level they knew they didn't need to run. They were already where they were supposed to be. Forensic criminology teaches us to look at the totality of the evidence, not just individual pieces. And when we look at the totality of what the ransom note reveals, we see a pattern that doesn't fit the intruder narrative. We see someone with intimate knowledge of the family, John's bonus amount, his business dealings, even his nickname from friends and colleagues. We see someone comfortable enough in the house to sit at a desk or table and write without fear of discovery. We see someone who used materials readily available in the home, suggesting either detailed advanced knowledge of where to find those materials or comfortable familiarity with the space. We see someone whose handwriting, while disguised in places, shows consistency and control that contradicts the image of a panicked criminal. All of those details point inward. They point to someone who belonged in that house, someone who had time, someone who wasn't afraid of being caught because they had nowhere to flee. From an anthropological lens, let's think about what the note reveals culturally. The language is distinctly American, middle class, educated. The references to movies like Dirty Harry and Speed are the references of someone steeped in popular culture of the time. The tone shifts between trying to sound tough and foreign. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction, and slipping into more casual, almost conversational phrasing. Use that good Southern common sense of yours. Those shifts tell us something about the person writing. They're performing. They're trying to sound like what they imagine a kidnapper would sound like. But the performance keeps slipping and the real person underneath keeps showing through. That's not the work of an actual foreign faction. That's not the work of experienced criminals who know how to communicate efficiently. That's the work of someone trying very hard to create a character, a voice, a story, and not quite succeeding. Because you can hear the effort in the language. You can hear someone reaching for words they think sound criminal, sound foreign, sound threatening. But what comes through instead is someone educated, someone American, someone who watches action movies and knows about business bonuses and understands exactly how much pressure to apply to sound scary without being so scary that the note gets dismissed entirely. Finally, let's think about this from the perspective of someone who needs to control a narrative. If you've done something terrible and you need time to figure out how to handle it, what do? You create a story that explains the situation in a way that points away from you. You give investigators something to chase. You make them look for phantom kidnappers and foreign factions and movie-obsessed criminals. You create complexity where the truth is simple. You create an outward threat where the threat was internal. That's what this note does. It sends everyone looking in the wrong direction. It creates a kidnapping scenario that justifies JonBenet's absence, that explains why she can't be found, that buys time for whoever wrote it to figure out what to do next. And the length of the note, those 3 pages that seem so excessive, actually serves that purpose. Because a long note feels more authentic in a strange way. It feels like the work of someone who really planned this out, who really thought it through. It creates an elaborate fiction that's harder to dismiss than a simple one-sentence demand would be. But the function of the note, the real function, wasn't to collect money. It was to create distance between what happened in that house and the investigation that would follow. It was to establish from the very beginning that this was an external crime, that strangers were responsible, that the family were victims, not participants. And for a while it worked. Everyone went looking for the kidnappers. Everyone analyzed the handwriting and the phrasing and the references, trying to figure out who wrote it. Everyone treated it as genuine evidence of an external threat. But the note itself, when you really look at it, when you strip away the assumptions and just examine what it's actually telling you, it's evidence of something else entirely. It's evidence that someone in that house needed a story. Someone needed time. Someone needed to create a narrative that would explain JonBenet's absence in a way that didn't point back to them. And they sat down, in the quiet of that house, surrounded by the remnants of Christmas, and they wrote. They wrote too much. They revealed too much. They tried too hard. And in trying so hard to sound like someone they weren't, they ended up revealing exactly who they were. Someone with access, someone with knowledge, someone with time, someone who wasn't running because they had nowhere to run, someone who was already home. Theme 2. The phone call that was never going to come. The ransom note is very specific about one thing. The phone call. Tomorrow between 8 and 10 a.m. I will call you. Not might call. Not will try to call. Will call. It's a promise, a commitment. The note builds its entire credibility around this moment, the moment when the kidnappers will make contact and give instructions for the exchange. That phone call is supposed to be the hinge point of the whole operation. Everything before it is setup, everything after it is execution. The call is when the kidnapping becomes real, when the transaction begins, when the family learns what they need to do to get JonBenet back safely. But that call never came. And more importantly, when it didn't come, nobody seemed particularly surprised. Nobody seemed devastated. Nobody seemed to escalate their panic from "my child is missing" to "the kidnappers didn't call, which means the plan has fallen apart and my child is in even more danger." The 10 a.m. deadline came and went, and life in that house just continued. People waited. People talked. People sat in rooms and stared at phones that didn't ring. But the absence of that call didn't create the crisis it should have created. And that tells us something, doesn't it? It tells us that nobody in that house truly expected the phone to ring. Nobody was holding their breath, watching the clock tick toward 10 a.m., praying that the call would come and this nightmare would move forward into its next phase. Because on some level, everyone understood, or at least someone understood, that there was no one to call, that the promise in the note was empty, that the kidnappers didn't exist and therefore couldn't keep their appointment. Let's think about this logically. If you're the parent of a kidnapped child and the ransom note says you'll receive a call between 8 and 10 a.m., what happens in your mind during that window? Every second is torture. Every time the phone rings, your heart stops. Every time it doesn't ring, your fear compounds. You're watching the clock, calculating how much time is left, praying that when the call comes, you'll say the right things, do the right things, whatever it takes to keep your child safe. And when 10 a.m. passes and the call hasn't come, you don't just sit quietly and wait some more. You break down. You demand that the police do something. You start imagining worst-case scenarios. Maybe the kidnappers changed their mind. Maybe something went wrong. Maybe they hurt her because you called the police despite the note's warning. Maybe the whole thing has fallen apart and your child is in even more danger now than she was before. That's the psychology of genuine terror. It escalates. It compounds. When the promised moment doesn't arrive, the fear doesn't plateau, it spikes. Because now you're in uncharted territory. Now the script you were given doesn't apply anymore. Now anything could be happening and you have no information, no control, no way to make it better. But that's not what we see in the Ramsey house that morning. We see waiting, yes. We see tension, yes. But we don't see the kind of catastrophic escalation that should happen when the kidnappers miss their own deadline. We don't see John Ramsey demanding that police flood the streets looking for his daughter. We don't see Patsy Ramsey collapsing in despair because the one moment of potential contact has passed without resolution. We see a strange kind of patience, a willingness to let time pass without the promised call, without any explanation for why it hasn't come. And that patience is revealing, because you can only be patient about a missed deadline if you already knew on some level that the deadline was never real. If you already understood that there was no one on the other end of the line waiting to make contact. If you already knew that the phone call, like everything else in the ransom note, was part of a fiction designed to create the appearance of a kidnapping that wasn't actually happening. From a philosophical perspective, there's something profound about a promise that's never meant to be kept. The ransom note makes a very specific commitment. We will call you tomorrow between 8 and 10 a.m. That commitment creates an expectation. It creates a moment in time when something definite is supposed to happen. And promises matter. They matter psychologically. They matter narratively. When someone promises something and doesn't deliver, it changes the entire dynamic. It breaks trust. It creates uncertainty. But the promise in the ransom note was never about creating trust. It was about creating time, about establishing a timeline that would keep everyone focused on a future moment, the phone call, while other things were happening or being arranged. The promise was a narrative device, not an operational plan. It gave the family and the police something to wait for, something to focus on, something to organize their morning around. And while everyone was waiting for that call, while everyone was treating the kidnapping as real and imminent, the person who wrote the note had time to think, time to stage, time to prepare for what would come next when the fiction inevitably collapsed. Psychologically, let's think about what it means to write a promise you know you'll never keep. It requires a certain kind of detachment, a certain ability to think ahead and understand that the promise itself serves a purpose even if it's never fulfilled. Most people, when they write something down, feel bound by it in some way. Writing creates commitment. But the person who wrote that ransom note understood that the promise of a phone call didn't need to be fulfilled to be useful. It just needed to be believed long enough to serve its function. And what was that function? To keep the investigation focused outward. To keep everyone believing that JonBenet was with kidnappers somewhere outside the house. To create a specific window of time, 8 to 10 a.m., during which the family and police would be occupied waiting, not searching the house thoroughly, not questioning the basic premise of the ransom note itself. From a physiological standpoint, consider what waiting for that phone call should have done to the bodies in that house. Anticipation creates a specific stress response. Your heart rate elevates, your cortisol levels spike, your attention narrows to a single point, in this case, the phone. You're hypervigilant. Every sound becomes amplified. You startle easily. You can't focus on anything else because your entire nervous system is primed for that one critical moment. But if you already know the call isn't coming, your body doesn't have that response. You might feel stress. Stress from guilt. Stress from fear of discovery. Stress from managing the performance of waiting. But you don't have the acute, focused stress of genuine anticipation. You're not waiting for something to happen. You're waiting for time to pass. And those are physiologically different experiences, which means we should be able to look at the behavior in that house during the 8 to 10 a.m. window and see evidence of whether people really believed the call was coming. Did they stay focused on the phone? Did they keep the line clear? Did they keep the house quiet so they wouldn't miss the ring? Or did they allow distractions, conversations, other activities that would be strange if they truly believed their child's fate hung on receiving that call? The accounts we have suggest that while people were ostensibly waiting, there was also a surprising amount of other activity happening. People moving through rooms, conversations occurring, a kind of ambient chaos that doesn't quite fit with the image of a family frozen in anticipation, staring at a phone, praying for it to ring. Forensic criminology teaches us to pay attention to what doesn't happen as much as what does happen. And what didn't happen that morning is significant. The phone didn't ring. The kidnappers didn't make contact. The promised next step in the kidnapping scenario never materialized. And yet, the investigation continued as though this was a minor hiccup rather than a catastrophic deviation from the plan outlined in the ransom note. Think about what should have happened. When the 10 a.m. deadline passed without a call, that should have been the moment when police shifted their entire approach. Because at that point, the ransom note's credibility is shattered. The kidnappers promised to call and didn't, which means either they changed their mind, which raises questions about why and what that means for JonBenet's safety, or the note was never legitimate in the first place. A thorough investigation would have immediately started questioning every assumption built on the ransom note's promises. But that doesn't seem to have happened. Instead, there was this strange continuation of the waiting. This extension of the timeline without anyone explicitly acknowledging that the fundamental premise, kidnappers who would call to arrange an exchange, had already failed. From an anthropological perspective, let's think about what the note's timeline reveals about the writer's understanding of how ransom situations work. The 8 to 10 a.m. window is oddly specific. Why those hours? If you're a real kidnapper, you'd probably call earlier while it's still dark when you can move around with less risk of being seen. Or you'd call later after you've had time to get far away and establish a safe position. But 8 to 10 a.m. is right in the middle of the morning. It's when neighborhoods are waking up, when people are starting their days, when there's likely to be activity, visibility, potential witnesses, and it's not the window a real criminal would choose. It's the window someone writing a note would choose because it sounds reasonable, because it gives enough time for the family to discover the note and read it and call the police, because it creates dramatic tension. Everyone waiting through the morning for this critical call. It's the choice of someone who's thinking narratively, not operationally. Someone who's writing a story, not planning an actual crime. Finally, let's consider this from the perspective of someone who needs to manage a crisis. If something has happened that you didn't intend, if you've found yourself in a situation where you need to explain the unexplainable, what do? You create a framework that buys you time. You create a story that keeps people looking away from the truth long enough for you to figure out how to handle it. The ransom note does exactly that. And the promise of a phone call between 8 and 10 a.m. is a crucial part of that framework, because it gives everyone something to do. It gives the family something to wait for. It gives the police something to prepare for. It keeps everyone occupied with the mechanics of responding to a kidnapping, clearing the phone line, preparing the ransom money, keeping the house quiet rather than searching thoroughly, asking hard questions, noticing the inconsistencies that don't quite add up. But the call was never going to come, because there was no one to make it. The kidnappers didn't exist. The foreign faction was a fiction. The whole elaborate scenario outlined in the ransom note was a story, and stories don't make phone calls. They just create space. Space between what really happened and what needs to be believed. Space between the truth and the investigation. Space between the person responsible and the consequences. And in that space, that morning, everyone waited for a phone that would never ring. Everyone operated under a premise that was fundamentally false. And when the call didn't come, when the promise in the note turned out to be empty, nobody seemed to recognize it for what it was. Proof that everything they'd been told in those 3 pages was a lie. We've walked through what should have happened and what actually happened, and the gap between those 2 realities tells us something crucial. The phone call was never going to come because there was no one to make it. The deadline was never going to be met because it was never meant to be met. The promise was empty from the moment it was written. And someone in that house knew it. Someone understood that they were waiting for something that would never arrive. Someone was performing the role of desperate parent, waiting for contact from kidnappers while knowing, on some level, that the entire scenario was a construction, a fiction, a story written to cover up the truth that was hiding right there in the basement. Theme 3. The details that betray the author. There's a moment in the ransom note where the writer reveals themselves completely, though you have to know what you're looking for to see it. It's not in the dramatic language about foreign factions or the threats about beheading. It's in the small details, the specific details, the details that only someone intimately familiar with the Ramsey family could possibly know. And those details, scattered throughout the note like breadcrumbs, lead us right back to the house. Right back to the family, right back to the truth that the note was supposed to conceal. Let's start with the most obvious one. $118,000. That's the ransom demand, not a round number like $100,000 or $200,000. Not a dramatic figure like $1 million, but $118,000. Oddly specific, and here's what makes it significant. That amount is almost exactly John Ramsey's bonus from his company that year. Not his salary, not his net worth, his bonus. A figure that wouldn't be public knowledge. A figure you'd only know if you were inside the family's financial life, if you'd seen paperwork, if you'd had conversations about money, if you were close enough to know the details of John's compensation package. A stranger wouldn't know that number. A stranger wouldn't care about that number. A stranger planning a kidnapping for ransom would do research on the family's wealth and demand an amount that seemed achievable. Maybe $50,000, maybe $250,000, something based on property values or business valuations or other publicly available indicators of the family's financial status. But $118,000? That's intimate knowledge. That's someone who knows the family well enough to know exactly what John could access quickly in cash. Someone who's been in conversations about finances. Someone who belongs in that world. And the note acknowledges this intimacy even as it tries to deny it. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction, it says. Foreign, external, other. But then it goes on to reference John's business, to demonstrate knowledge of his bonuses and his access to money, to speak directly to him in ways that suggest familiarity rather than distance. The note tries to sound like strangers, but it keeps slipping into the language of insiders. Let's think about this logically. If you're writing a ransom note and you want it to be believed, you need to demonstrate that you're serious, that you're capable, that you have the child, and you're prepared to follow through on your threats. But you also need to maintain the fiction that you're external to the family, that you're strangers who targeted them for comprehensible reasons, their wealth, their visibility, something that makes sense as a motive for kidnapping. But this note can't quite maintain that fiction. It knows too much. It speaks too familiarly. It references things that strangers shouldn't reference, and in doing so, it betrays its author. Because the only person who could write this note, who could know these details, who could speak with this familiarity, who could demonstrate this level of intimate knowledge while trying to sound like an outsider, is someone who isn't an outsider at all. From a philosophical perspective, there's something profound about the act of writing yourself out of your own handwriting, out of your own knowledge, out of your own voice. The ransom note is an exercise in performance. The writer is trying very hard to sound like someone they're not. They're trying to create a character, a foreign criminal, someone dangerous, someone who operates according to different rules. But performance is difficult. It requires constant vigilance. You have to remember at every moment that you're not writing as yourself, you're writing as the character. And maintaining that character across 3 pages, across dozens of sentences, across all those words, it's nearly impossible. Which is why the note keeps breaking, why it keeps revealing the person underneath. The foreign faction sounds American. The tough criminal uses business terminology. The dangerous kidnapper demonstrates concern about Southern common sense. The voice keeps shifting. The mask keeps slipping, and what shows through is someone educated, American, familiar with the family, trying desperately to sound like someone else. Psychologically, this tells us something crucial about the state of mind of the person writing. They're not in control. They're not calm and calculated despite the neat handwriting. They're scattered. They're reaching for language that will sound right, that will create the impression they need to create, but they're pulling from their own vocabulary, their own knowledge, their own world. They can't fully separate themselves from what they know. So the note becomes a hybrid. Part fiction, part truth, part performance, part confession. Think about what it takes to sustain a lie across 3 pages. You have to remember what you've already said. You have to make sure the details are consistent. You have to maintain the voice, the tone, the character you're creating. And all of that requires cognitive bandwidth. It requires focus, but when you're writing under stress, when you're trying to create a story that will cover up something terrible, when you're operating in crisis mode, your ability to maintain that kind of control diminishes. You make mistakes. You reveal things you didn't mean to reveal. You let the truth slip through the fiction. And that's what we see in the ransom note. We see someone trying very hard to sound like a criminal, like a stranger, like someone foreign and dangerous. But we also see them failing. We see them using language and references that come from their own world. We see them demonstrating knowledge that they shouldn't have. We see the performance breaking down under the weight of trying to maintain it. From a physiological standpoint, consider what stress does to memory and decision-making. When you're under acute stress, your brain doesn't work the way it normally does. Your working memory gets compromised. Your ability to think flexibly, to imagine how someone else would speak or write, to maintain a consistent character across a long piece of writing, all of that becomes harder. You default to what you know. You use the words that come naturally to you. You reference things from your own experience because reaching for unfamiliar references takes cognitive effort you don't have in that moment. So the fact that this note is full of references to John's business, to his bonus, to the family's circumstances, that's not strategic. That's default. That's the writer falling back on what they know because maintaining the fiction of being an outsider is too cognitively demanding in a moment of crisis. Forensic linguists, when they analyze ransom notes and threatening letters, look for exactly these kinds of tells. They look for moments when the writer's true voice breaks through, when vocabulary that's too sophisticated or too specific reveals education level or background, when references reveal cultural knowledge or social class, when phrasing reveals age or region or familiarity with the target. And this note is full of those tells. The references to movies like Dirty Harry suggest someone of a certain generation, someone who grew up watching action films from the 70s and 80s. The business terminology suggests someone familiar with corporate structures and compensation packages. The Southern common sense reference suggests someone who either is from the South or is close enough to the Ramseys to know their background. Every detail narrows the pool of possible authors. Every reference points away from foreign faction and towards someone much closer to home. From an anthropological perspective, the note reveals class and culture in ways the writer probably didn't intend. This is not the language of someone from outside American middle-class culture. It's steeped in that culture. The movie references the business talk, the concern about appearing to be a good parent if the note is shown to anyone. Even the threats, beheading, execution, have a theatrical quality that suggests someone whose knowledge of violence comes from movies, not from actual experience with organized crime or terrorist operations. Real kidnappers from foreign factions don't write like this. They write tersely. They write with authority born of genuine danger. They don't ramble. They don't reference movies. They don't demonstrate intimate knowledge of the victim's family finances. They maintain operational security by revealing as little as possible about who they are and what they know. But this writer couldn't help themselves. They had to show that they knew things. They had to reference John's business, his bonus, the family's circumstances. Because on some level, the note isn't just about creating the fiction of a kidnapping. It's also about demonstrating power, about showing that they know intimate details, about making clear that they're not just random criminals, but people who have access to information that should be private. And that demonstration of knowledge, that need to show what they know, is ultimately what betrays them. Because the more they reveal, the more obvious it becomes that they're not strangers at all. Finally, let's think about this from the perspective of someone trying to control a narrative. If you're writing a ransom note to cover up something that happened in your house, you have competing needs. You need the note to be believable enough that it points the investigation away from you, but you also need it to be specific enough that it explains the situation, that it accounts for details that might otherwise seem suspicious, that it creates a comprehensive alternative explanation for what's happened. Those competing needs create tension in the writing. On one hand, you want to sound like a stranger, distant, external, other. On the other hand, you need to demonstrate enough knowledge to be credible, to show that you really have the child, to explain things that might otherwise seem odd. And in trying to balance those needs, you end up revealing more than you intend. The $118,000 demand is the perfect example. It makes the ransom seem achievable, which makes the kidnapping seem real. But it also reveals intimate knowledge of John's finances. The reference to his business makes the threat seem targeted and serious. But it also reveals familiarity with his professional life. The entire note tries to walk this line, sounding external while demonstrating internal knowledge, and it can't quite pull it off. Because at the end of the day, you can't write from outside a perspective you don't have. You can only write from inside what you know. And what this note knows, what it demonstrates on every page, is intimate familiarity with the Ramsey family, with their finances, with their home, with their world. A stranger couldn't have written this note. Someone with superficial knowledge of the family couldn't have written this note. Only someone on the inside, someone with access to private financial information, someone familiar with the household, someone comfortable enough in that space to sit down and write for however long it took, could have written these words. And that someone wasn't part of a foreign faction, that someone wasn't a stranger breaking into the house in the middle of the night, that someone was already there, already had access, already knew the details they needed to know because they lived them, because they were part of the family's daily life, because they belonged in that house in a way that no intruder ever could. We've walked through the note piece by piece, and every piece points in the same direction. The length that suggests comfort and time rather than urgency. The phone call that was never going to come because there was no one to make it. The intimate details that only an insider could know. All of it tells us the same thing. This note wasn't written by strangers. It was written by someone who knew too much, revealed too much, tried too hard to sound like someone they weren't. And in that trying, in that performance, in that desperate attempt to create a fiction that would hold, they ended up writing the truth. Not the truth they meant to write, but the truth that shows through when you look carefully at what they couldn't help but reveal. The truth that points right back to the house, right back to the family, right back to someone who had every reason to write a ransom note that wasn't really about ransom at all, but about buying time, creating distance, pointing the investigation anywhere but toward the unbearable reality that was waiting to be discovered in the basement. Outro. We've walked through the ransom note, all 3 pages of it, and we've seen how it falls apart when you look closely. How it's too long to be strategic, too specific to be written by strangers, too intimate to be the work of a foreign faction. We've seen how the promised phone call was never going to come because there was no one to make it. We've seen how the details, the $118,000, the references to John's business, the language and tone, all betray an author who knew too much, who couldn't quite maintain the fiction they were trying to create. The ransom note isn't evidence of a kidnapping. It's evidence of someone trying desperately to make a kidnapping seem real when they knew, when they had to know, that JonBenet had never left the house, that there were no kidnappers, that the whole scenario was a construction designed to point the investigation away from the truth. And that truth was already there, waiting in the basement. While everyone was focused on the note, on the phone call that would never come, on the foreign faction that didn't exist, JonBenet was exactly where she'd been all along. Not with kidnappers, not in some external location, but in her own home, placed there by someone who knew the house well enough to know where to hide her, at least temporarily. Someone who needed time to figure out what to do. Someone who wrote 3 pages of fiction to buy that time. Next time, we'll look at what happened when that deadline passed, when the phone didn't ring, when 10 a.m. came and went and the whole carefully constructed timeline started to fall apart. We'll examine what that silence meant and what it revealed about who in that house already knew there would be no call. Because the absence of that phone call tells us almost as much as the note itself. It tells us that someone wasn't waiting for kidnappers to make contact. They were just waiting for time to pass. For the story to play out long enough that when it finally collapsed, when the truth finally had to be faced, They'd have had those hours to prepare, to think, to make sure the story, even in its collapse, would still point away from them. But stories can only hold for so long, and the truth has a way of showing through the cracks.